Good afternoon, everybody. I think we're ready to get started. I'd like to introduce myself. I'm Alex Spencer. I'm a curator in the aeronautics department, and I handle what we call our flight material collection: uniforms, flight clothing, small bric-a-brac, and memorabilia of pilots, specifically with the military side of the collection. And I'm going to be introducing our new book that I was participated in as co-editor with Dr. Michael Neufeld, from our chairman of our Space History Division, on the National Air and Space Museum and an autobiography. This is a bit different from previous books that we have about museums, such as C.D.D. Bryan's The National Air and Space Museum, or Andrew Chaikin's Air and Space, where those books featured like the history of air and space and space and aviation, or Bryan's book on the National Air and Space Museum, where it focused on the galleries. This one is actually a history of this museum and how it came together and how we became what we are. And with that said, we needed to figure out how we were going to put such a book together. And the idea itself came out in the fall of 2009 when Ted Maxwell, who was our associate director for collections and research, suggested that it was time that we needed a new museum book. So the staff members from the various departments got together and kind of hashed out where we were going to go with this new book and what needed to be in it. And I looked over my initial notes from the discussions from those early meetings, and we really did not stray too far from where we ended up with and what those initial discussions were. And we ended up with, and the idea of an autobiography is very important, because it was done by members of the staff of the National Air and Space Museum from across the staff, from Aeronautics Division, Space History, Center of Earth and Planetary Studies, our Archives Division, our photographers and such. So it really was a complete team effort from us here at the museum. I want to point out that we had 5 chapter authors. For Chapter 1, Flight in the Smithsonian, Dr. Tom Crouch. Building a Collection, Chapter 2, was done by Dr. Bob Vanderlinden from our Aeronautics Division. The Long Road to a New Museum by Dr. Dominic Pisano. Then we go to Chapter 4, The World's Most Popular Museum, was done up by Ted Maxwell and Dr. Tom Crouch as well. And then finally, Spreading Our Wings was the last and final chapter, was done by Dr. Dick Daso out of our Aeronautics Department. In addition to the chapter authors, I need to point out that we were heavily dependent on other staff members as well, and I would like to point out that we have a huge debt of gratitude to our staff photographers, Mark Avino, Eric Long, and Dane Penlin, who we needed to illustrate this book heavily, and we would always send them out on emergency photography when something was missing out of the book at some corner or piece such as that. And from our Archives Division, Marilyn Graskowitz, who provided research assistant, and Melissa Kaiser, our photo archivist. We couldn't have done it without them. And then, and finally, I would like to say something. We'd like to point out that we had to search around for a publisher, and our first choice was really National Geographic. We had a track record with them in the past with Joanne London's collections book titled Fly Now on our poster collection, and we had been working with them in the past, and I'd like to say a very large gratitude to National Geographic and Susan Hitchcock and her team there. We couldn't have done it without them as well. The design of the book itself was each chapter is a chronological history. We kind of had to fudge it a little bit at the end with chapters 4 and 5 because there was some definite overlap there between the two chapters. But there were definite parts and pieces that follow throughout the book. For example,
use your phone to make a donation by texting FLIGHT to 20222. Each text message donated.
Thank you. Sorry about that. But anyways, we open up each chapter with what the designer would call the galleries that would feature the aircraft and/or spacecraft of the museum. Of course, the earlier chapters focused in on aircraft, with then the spacecraft mixed in the later 3 chapters. And that was done because there was an expectation by the designers at Geographic that our purchasing audience would really want to see pictures of these artifacts in the book. Then they would follow by inner chapter, what we described as the inner chapters, and these were important stories that we felt had to be told. But if they were actually mixed in with the regular text of the chapters, we were fearful that they would overwhelm that chapter's theme. So we decided to just pull out these topics and fit them in between the chapters where they fit appropriately. The next part of the book we had, and again in the in-between chapters, were voices of the museum that were important individuals and people, and actually, people that were working every day here at the museum. One of our docents was featured, but these were stories to personalize the events that were taking place in those major chapters. And then we also had what we Geographic asked for what we called the superlatives, which were to feature, highlight, and important milestone artifacts in the collection. And then finally, we featured a collection page, which were small artifacts, which was to emphasize the vastness and richness of the National Air and Space Museum's collections, other than the aircraft that everybody knows so well. And we wanted to make sure those were featured. And actually, the smaller collections were spread throughout the book. Now, the production on this book was quite rapid. We got into discussions about just the design, the layout of the book in the fall of 2009, and we're trying to pitch the idea to Geographic to have them produce the book for us. And by January of 2010, this year, we went straight into production and writing of the book. And for the next 3 months, everybody went on their way by themselves and wrote each of their chapters. So by the time the end of March came about, everybody had finished finished the major text, and then the ball went over to Geographic, and they went into rapid design and layout mode, and that was completed in June. We were on this rush production schedule in such a way so that we could get the book under wraps by the end of September, and that would allow us to make the sales for this time of year. Now, one of the key features of the book is that because it's by Geographic, it's heavily illustrated, and as we say on the back cover of the book, we have 700 illustrations inside the book. But that's kind of a misnomer when you're doing a book production like this. You actually have to double, even triple that number of photographs that we provided to Geographic because the designers need something, the color contrast might not be quite right for a particular photograph, so they want something else. So something else would have to go in its place. And I have to put special recognition in for Melissa Kaiser, our photo archivist, again, for the work that she did, because this put an extra burden on her, and she came through like a champion for us. And with that said, I would like to finish up by saying my part of the introduction on the book, that because of working with Geographic, working with our own photography, producing new photography, we're able to produce what I think is a beautiful and colorful book, but there's actually some real substance behind it, provided in the text, done up by our professional historians and curators here on the staff of the National Air and Space Museum. And with that, I'd like to introduce Dr. Michael Neufeld from our chair of our Space History Department on the book itself.
Thank you. Now, this lecture is basically based on photographs, and given our time constraints, I may have to rush through this tour of the history of the Air and Space Museum from the very beginning of our origins and this is a look at the table of contents again, but Alex has already discussed that. The first chapter by Tom Crouch is about the prehistory. Before there was a museum, the Smithsonian had a very long, decades-long engagement with flight. This began with the very first secretary on the left, Joseph Henry, the first secretary of the Smithsonian Institution, which, of course, as most of you know, was founded in 1846. He was not only a prominent physicist, the best-known scientist, the most prominent scientist in the United States in the mid-19th century. he was also very interested in balloons and how balloons could be used to observe the atmosphere and gather meteorological and other data. And so he had contacts with balloonists going back to 1835 before the Smithsonian ever existed. And as Tom discusses in this early chapter, he was extensively involved in trying to assist various ballooning projects before the Civil War, and very notably, very involved in starting the Union Army Balloon Corps. And the man on the right is Thaddeus Lowe, was a balloonist who was instrumental in launching the Balloon Corps. And as Tom Crouch has told us also in other times, that in fact he inflated a balloon and ascended from the mall just in front of where the building now stands on June 16th, 1861, and sent a telegram to the White House about the potential of the balloon as a reconnaissance platform to President Lincoln, the very first message ever sent from a balloon, telegraphic message ever sent from a balloon. Lowe was involved in the Balloon Corps, which Henry supported. This is a picture taken at the Battle of Fair Oaks, Virginia, either May 31 or June 1, 1862. And the Balloon Corps continued all the way up with the Army of the Potomac, all the way up through 1863, when Lowe became disgusted by the lack of support he felt he was getting from the Army. However, the first aeronautical objects in the Air and Space Museum were the kites that the Chinese Imperial Commission gave to us at the conclusion of the 1876 Centennial Exhibition in Philadelphia. And this is a picture, an old black and white picture of one of the kites that was taken after it was we acquired it in 1876. And these kites actually still exist today. They're split between our museum and the Natural History's anthropology collections. Of course, the most famous sort of Smithsonian engagement with flight before there ever was a museum or really a collection was with the third secretary, Samuel Pierpont Langley, who is here pictured on the right. And Langley, the third secretary, of course, became very much involved. He made his name as an astronomer, but he became very much involved in experimentation and trying to build a heavier-than-air airplane that worked in the late 19th century. And he's pictured here with one of his chief associates at the end of the 19th century, and who also became the pilot for the 1903 flight attempts, Charles Manley. Most famously and significantally, Langley succeeded in May 6, 1896, in launching Aerodrome Number 5, a subscale of a model, a steam-powered aircraft. It was really the first sort of demonstration of a heavier-than-air airplane in the world. It was a very, very significant achievement. Succeeded in several flights with this aerodrome and another, which led him to try to go for a manned airplane. And this is the south shed that was built behind the castle in 1898 as the workshop. I suppose it must stand about the middle of where the House Garden is now, was to build the Great Aerodrome. And for the Great Aerodrome, he received then a very large sum of $50,000 from the Army for building a manned airplane. Great hopes were invested in that enterprise, which came to launching in the fall of 1903. Of course, with a disastrous result. And this is the second of the two failures. When the Great Aerodrome was launched, he always used a houseboat. He had a larger houseboat for the Great Aerodrome. Second of two failures, and as the picture reveals, the thing was structurally incapable of flying. It literally broke as soon as it was launched. And this was a humiliation for Langley, and in many ways overshadowed the rest of his life and greatly shortened his life, as Tom mentions, between this and a scandal about the misappropriation of funds by the treasurer of the Smithsonian in 1905. Langley died rather prematurely in 1906 after a couple of strokes. the first airplane we actually collected, other than the Langley stuff, which was stored away in crates and not really collected as museum artifacts at that time, was the Wright 1909 military flyer, which of course is down here in the early flight gallery. This airplane was collected in 1911, after the Smithsonian gave the Wright brothers the Langley Medal. But of course, famously, the Wright brothers had succeeded in flying only 9 days after the second failure of the great aerodrome, and after certainly 1908 were international celebrities. But it's an interesting story why when the Wright brothers offered us an airplane, we collected this airplane and not the 1903 airplane, the first of a series of seriously stupid mistakes that was made by the Smithsonian in regards to this. And it seems to have been rooted fundamentally in the Force Secretary, Charles Walcott, the great honor that he held Langley's memory in, and willingness to go do everything to protect Langley's memory. Now, Walcott was a famous geologist. He's now well known as the discoverer of the Burgess Shale, which revealed a Precambrian explosion of life. But at the time, he was very much defending Langley's reputation, and that led to a feud between the Smithsonian or the surviving Wright brother, Orville Wright, that stretched on for a long time. But before I mention a little more about that, I just wanted to, one other thing we mentioned in the book, and that is Walcott's central place in launching the National Advisory Committee for Aeronautics, NACA, the predecessor of NASA in 1915. As one of the key scientists in the United States, he was instrumental in creating the forerunner of NASA in 1915. Of course, this is the 1903 airplane. On this picture, it doesn't show very well, in the famous picture of the first flight on December 17, 1903. And as Tom mentioned, there was the result of this airplane did not come to the Smithsonian until 1948 because of a long feud between Walcott and the Smithsonian and Orville Wright, because the Smithsonian would not concede the actual achievement of the Wrights in a clear and unambiguous way, but kept insisting, at least in the early years, that Langley had designed the first aircraft capable of flight, even though it had failed to actually fly. And there was a long delay, and Tom lays that out in the first interchapter on the Wright-Smithsonian controversy. Now, this is actually the first museum building we had. It wasn't at this time, of course, there was no Air Museum or Air and Space Museum at all as an organization. Air collections were part of the Division of Mechanical and Mineral Technology of the Smithsonian. But at the end of World War I, we got use of this building, which was constructed in 1917 to test Liberty engines, and then was used for storage on the south grounds. And this is interesting when you look at this. That's what Independence Avenue looked like in the 1930s. It was a two-lane road. And it looks like there's fences for houses that are directly across the street, which would now sit in the middle of the broad street that now exists. But anyway, the aircraft building, as it was titled, was refurbished at the end of the war, made more permanent, and became the exhibiting place for predominantly in the early years the World War I collection that we received, the captured German airplanes and some Allied and American airplanes that we received. It's now formed the core of the World War I collection that we have. And some other war-related items. In the picture, you can see a World War I tank is still sitting out in front of this building. I think the mic cut out there for a second. Still sitting in front of the building in 1935. The person who really created this museum or created a collection for this museum, of course, was Paul Garber. He arrived as a very, very junior exhibit preparator in 1920. Only got a job because he accidentally held a conversation with Walcott, who he didn't even know, and Walcott decided, let's keep that kid around. And it was born in 1899. Was an aircraft enthusiast, a very, very great aircraft enthusiast. Took piloting lessons, though he never finished his license, and was briefly a member of the Army Air Service in World War I. Never left the Washington D.C. area. But of course, this is a picture of Paul in front of the Spirit of St. Louis, where it now is, in the Milestones of Flight Gallery, and famously, he was absolutely crucial to collecting that airplane in 1927 by talking the secretary into sending a telegram to Paris to suggest to Lindbergh that he give the airplane to us if after he arrived, and he arrived safely. Paul also collected very many crucial and important artifacts in this period. This is the Douglas World Cruiser Chicago that's in the Pioneers Gallery in 1924 during its around-the-world flight, and Garber was crucial to acquiring that airplane. Another one was Wiley Post's Winnie Mae. And so there was a whole list of very famous aircraft that Garber was absolutely crucial to collecting in the 20s and the 30s. And I just also wanted to put this picture in because you can sort of see, in addition to the aircraft building, there was some space in the arts and industries building, and a very typical example of how exhibits looked in that period. It's all just glass cases, just vitrines, and vitrines with little labels in them, and that is exhibition technology of the 1930s. During this period, we were also involved with Robert Goddard, the rocket experimenter, a relationship which began in 1916-17. Tom Crouch outlines in the second interchapter on the Goddard-Smithsonian relationship, and the Smithsonian was very crucial to financing his early experiments, and he maintained a strong connection with us all throughout. And this rocket is either the one that's in the Hodge Center now, or it's one very, very similar to it. That was the very first rocket artifact we received, was an A-series rocket that's now at Hodge. We received in 1935, where it was promptly locked away in the basement of the castle because Goddard didn't want anybody to see it. And it didn't actually see the light of day until the late 1940s. The Second World War caused the Smithsonian to take many of its artifacts out and put them in storage. It was an interlude in this time. Garber worked for the Navy, but right after the war, the National Air Museum was created. It was created as an initiative, first and foremost, of the Chief of the Army Air Forces, Hap Arnold. Arnold had collected with the Army Air Forces a very large collection of World War II aircraft of German, Japanese, American, and also a few British and other aircraft in that huge collection. This is a picture taken right after the National Air Museum Act was signed in 1946. On the left is Senator Jennings Randolph of West Virginia. Garber on the right, obviously in the middle, Wayne Parrish, publisher of American Aviation. An air museum officially came into existence on August the 12th, 1946, but was pretty much of a paper organization for many years to come. By and large, other than the fact that the museum existed on paper, our situation was not drastically different, except we had a whole lot more artifacts, and the Air Force collection was stored at Park Ridge, Illinois, which is now O'Hare Airport, in a Douglas aircraft plant, and of course is one of my favorite artifacts, the V-2 there. The Air Force collection was an enormous boon and also a gigantic problem. What to do with it, and especially when the Korean War broke out, when the emergency got worse in the winter of 50-51, the Army Air Forces wanted the plant back and essentially kicked the Smithsonian out. It took several years to clear the building and figure out what to do with them, and the stuff had to be brought back here. Some of it was lost because there was no way to save everything. Some valuable aircraft and things were junked or given away and never and lost forever. But we got an enormous amount of stuff which was brought back to Maryland, a story I'll mention in a minute. But this is a picture of the aircraft building as it looked in the early 50s. And you can see, we can date it in part because you can see the Bell X-1 in the foreground here, the right wing of it hanging in the foreground. It was an incredibly crowded space. I mean, Garber's reaction was always just keep collecting more stuff, and the Smithsonian administration had to keep restraining him, try to restrain him. Carl Mittman, his superior for many years, tried to restrain him, but he kept collecting more stuff. So conditions became very crowded. Here's a picture of actually the X1 and Garber being installed in September, October 1950 in the old aircraft building. But Garber was instrumental in creating what is now called the Garber Facility, our storage area outside Suitland in Silver Hill, Maryland. But the conditions were very inadequate, and this is kind of like the bad side of what Garber looked like in those days, which was the things we couldn't get indoors, sat outdoors, and were often heavily damaged by the elements. The resources simply weren't there. The struggle began then to create an actual new museum building, and this illustration out of the book has three concepts for the building. The top two are the same one. In 1955, we had the first concept drawing for the building, and then there's an architectural model of it. As you can see from the architectural model, it's actually standing across Independence Avenue from the castle. It's where the Forrestal building of Energy Department is today in the L'Enfant Plaza complex. And that fell through. Urban redevelopment for the Southwest, which basically in those days amounted to flattening everything in sight, kicking the people out and building something from scratch. Urban redevelopment plans overtook that plan. It never went anywhere. And the next building concept is from 1964. This concept is actually for this site. I'm sort of glad from an architectural standpoint it never got built, because I think it's pretty ugly, but it was large. It was larger than this building. It was intended to cover the entire block from 4th to 7th. And of course at the bottom, our modern building, which was the architectural model, I assume, is from about 1972. But there was a long series of struggles that Don Pisano in Chapter 3 outlines about trying to get to a building, and before we finally succeeded in breaking through in the early 70s. Now, before that time, space artifacts started arriving. It started arriving in 1959. Rockets were put outside the Arts and Industries building, and until this building was constructed, and a lot of them were put over here in the missile pit, those were the rockets were sitting outside the old Arts and Industries building, where part of the Air Museum exhibits came. And of course, with the arrival of the space artifacts, the increasing discussion about retitling the museum the National Air and Space Museum, which actually passed in legislation in 1966. This is the Freedom 7 Alan Shepard's capsule, shown in the old aircraft building, or tin shed as it was known, somewhat unaffectionately, I think. But this is the tin shed as it appeared in the 1960s, with the Freedom 7 on display after October 61. This was the first human spacecraft we got, and it's also part of a sort of initiated a process by which we came eventually to an agreement with NASA that I discuss in the third interchapter on how the NASA-NASM agreement arose in 1967, and we started to develop a very close relationship with NASA. The key to building the new building was probably two people. One of them was Senator Barry Goldwater, who started campaigning in 1970-71 to do something about the long-stalled plan for a building. And the other person was Mike Collins, the Apollo 11 astronaut, who came on board as the director in 1971. And although a lot of people think of him as the first director, he was actually the third person to hold the title. There were two previous directors in the late 50s and 60s who spearheaded the attempt to get a new building. Mike Collins was crucial in trying to build the organization that would actually create this place. And that picture, by the way, was taken on the day of opening. Now, this is what the exhibit looked like, and one of the many great pictures in this book that I love to see of the old museum and our old exhibits prior to this building. This is a hall in the Arts and Industries, which in many ways resembles Milestones. It's a precursor to Milestones, may have been intentionally so, because part of the plan for moving this building was to set up exhibitions that would then lead the way to build exhibitions here. And here's Milestones being constructed in 75, 76. Inside this building before it's opened. I think we got a lot more space in arts and industries. We weren't able to verify this, but I think we got a lot more space in arts and industries after the Museum of History and Technology and the now Museum of American History pulled out all its stuff in the early 60s. This is opening day, July 1, 1976, with President Gerald Ford, and he's going to shake hands with Chief Justice Warren Burger, head of the Board of Regents, and behind Ford is the then Secretary, S. Dillon Ripley. Of course, the building was an incredible instant success, and this is one of the early days of the building, the Skylab here, just outside the door. And the enormous crowds that came into this building, 5 million people by the end of December 1976, and almost 10 million in the first year. So it was an instant and overnight success, and we became the most visited museum in the world. Now, one of the many things that happened in this time is professionalization of the museum organization. I'll only run through a couple of examples here, but Ted Maxwell wrote Chapter 4 along with Tom Crouch, would want me to say something about the rise of research in the building. It's a picture of Annie Johnson from SEPS in recent times in Death Valley during a geological expedition. But I mean, we had not only the creation of Center for Earth and Planetary Studies, which came out of a contractor, Belcom, for NASA, that was being closed down. But then also we had the professionalization of the space history and aeronautics departments, as they're now called. And the arrival of historians like Tom Crouch, among others, who really turned this institution into a research institution. Archives Division, another professionalizing organization that came out of this, is a film storage for archives, rose out of all the stuff we had. It had to be turned into a professional archival organization, and we're now working towards, of course, with a new facility at Dulles and having a really professional archive center, a real professional storage conditions too that match this organization. And of course, I could mention many departments, exhibits, and others. But of course, the restoration facility at Garber, which became in the wake of trying to build a new building and after a much more professional restoration and preservation building. Ted and Tom mentioned in this chapter, of course, that Garber also became in the 80s and 90s, particularly our second museum. They took many of the buildings, straightened them out, and turned them into a no-frills museum, essentially, in many ways, the precursor to what Hazy is today. But the flip side of Garber was, this is a storage building in recent times before the move to Hazy. Incredible overcrowding as our storage overwhelmed our artifact collecting overwhelmed what the storage conditions that we had at Garber. Now, I can't go through this thing without mentioning the Enola Gay, and that's a long story in itself. And the story of its intertwining with the history of the building goes back all the way to 1946, when it's on the list of aircraft that Hap Arnold wanted to give to the museum. It actually arrived the title to it was actually given in 1949 and served a symbolic purpose over many decades. On and off, the fact that it was in storage after 1960-61, couldn't be restored, or there was no place to show it really as a whole airplane, was repeatedly used by the Air and Space Museum until at least the 60s, after which I get the feeling like anti-nuclear sentiment and things made it more uncomfortable for this airplane to be there. And of course, part of the story is the great controversy of 1994-95. I could take a whole hour just to talk about that. With the net result of significant changes in the museum, which is outlined in that chapter, but and it's certainly a bitter experience in many ways. But we did restore the airplane in the finish the restoration, since it had been started years before, in the aftermath of the Enola Gay battle of 1994-95. And this is the picture of the airplane in 2003, before the opening of the building, before it was put on jacks and raised up to a higher level where it now is in the building. Before even, for some time before the controversy, Enola Gay had already been used as one of the artifacts that should be used as a basis for starting another facility. And Dulles Airport was always the favored location. There was a little political maneuvering around that. But certainly the arrival of the Space Shuttle Enterprise in 1985 at Dulles sort of precipitated the need to do more about finding a new location out there or building a new building out there. It had to be stored outdoors at first, and a building was constructed to at least cover it over. But it would take obviously 18 more years before we actually had a building at Hazy. SR-71, which arrived in 1990 after setting a transcontinental speed record, another crucial artifact, with here being put into a storage place at the Dulles Airport, was another artifact that was important towards motivating the creation of an Udvar-Hazy Center. Here, of course, Stephen F. Udvar-Hazy, the benefactor, who in 1999, by giving us $60 million and $5 million later, was the guy who made it possible to actually build the facility here under construction in 2002. Of course, there are a number of directors who are crucial to that process too, notably Donning and our current director, Jack Daly. And here's the construction of the Hazy Center circa 2002 from above. And opening day, December 15th, 2003, also an enormous success at the beginning with about 1 million people a year, maybe not quite as many as we hope, but certainly a very good visitorship for the location. It can only really practically be reached by car. This is the enormous aviation hangar, which is now the Boeing aviation hangar, and its counterpart, the McDonnell Space Hangar, where the Space Shuttle Enterprise now is. And this is finally the construction site now that's now actually done. This was taken last year. Phase 2 of the Hazy Center, which had to be postponed in order to get something done and built by 2003. The Archive Center, the new restoration facility, a new closed storage facility, conservation lab, all of this now being built and now on the verge of being open. So in conclusion here, I just wanted to show you a couple of beautiful shots that our photographers took of our facilities. This is the Hazy Center at dusk and this building at dawn. Obviously Eric or somebody went out at dawn, got up very early one morning, take this picture of the Air and Space Museum at dawn. So in conclusion, thanks. We've just become, as you can see from this thing, an enormously successful institution, still one of the 2 most visited museums in the world. Thank you very much. We're ready to answer any questions if you have any. You were supposed to come to the microphone. And nobody's brave enough to break the ice. Okay, one gentleman. Tell us who you are by the first.
I'm Lester Reingold. Apologies if you've already touched on this, but could you comment on the disposition of the shuttle fleet as it retires? Is Enterprise going to be swapped out for one of the retired spacecraft?
Disposition of the shuttle fleet, we don't know, I guess is the only honest answer. We have asked for discovery. That is the oldest surviving shuttle with the longest flight record, the most varied flight. So, discovery we hope will come to the Air and Space Museum, but that still remains open because NASA has not announced what exactly it's going to do. So I wish I could give you the definitive answer that it was coming, but we actually don't know yet.
If that did happen, would Enterprise then go somewhere else?
Yes, that's the plan. The Enterprise would go to another qualified museum as a result of the deal. And of course, that's going to require bringing, with the Dulles picture in 85, bring the shuttle carrier aircraft in with the Discovery and go out with the Enterprise. Cutting in and out of this microphone for some reason.
How would you characterize the planning and the writing of the work as an institutional project? Do you feel that there is new knowledge, new insight into the place of the museum in American culture and that can be found in the book.
Yeah, I think so. Because as a project, Alex already talked about how many departments had to be involved in this to pull this off. So I think we really, we succeeded very, like any such project, it had its moments of terror and wonder, are we going to get this thing together on time, or is this going to come together or not? But of course, it all worked out extremely well. As Alex mentioned, Melissa in particular had to deal with an enormous number of picture files. That was a headache of major proportions to try to get this, because the demands of modern publishing mean very high resolution digital images, much higher resolution digital images than are often easily available. On the value side, I think, in the end, I concluded that this was a pretty sound project. Clearly, this is not a scholarly book. We don't have footnotes. We couldn't, because of the nature of the publication, we couldn't turn it into an academic treatise. But I think we give a very sound history. Now, of course, a more scholarly treatment is yet to be done. Someone who would analyze this institution and its history in a richer political, social, cultural context from outside. But I think as a narrative of the history of the building and of the Smithsonian's involvement of flight before there was a museum or a collection, I think it's pretty sound. All right. Anybody else? We're out of here.
Okay. We'll be out signing books out front. Thank you, folks.
Yeah, book signing out in front. This one was mine, right?
That one.
Or did you switch?